Whether it's the thickness of the woods or murky canals, volunteers searching for 6-year-old Christopher Barrios say the words "give up" is nowhere in their mindset.
Brunswick is a city situated along the southeast coast of Georgia that is steeped in rich history and southern charm. With its cobblestone streets, moss-draped oaks and sprawling marshlands, it's a place where life moves a little slower. It's a city that prides itself on its tight-knit community, a place where, when something happens to one family, it feels like it happens to all. Just outside the city limits, tucked off Canal Road, near the steady rush of Interstate 95, sits the Canal Mobile Home Park. It's a modest patchwork of single wides and trailers that circle around a road called Horseshoe Lane. It's a quiet area, mostly working class families and retirees, where kids ride their bikes in the street and dogs bark from behind chain link fences. Life in the park wasn't glamorous, but it was familiar. Among the rows of weather-worn homes, there was one family that never quite blended in. People noticed them, not because they were loud or friendly, but because they watched. The father would sit out on the steps and stare. The son had a way of looking at the neighbourhood kids that made people feel uncomfortable. Some residents whispered about him. They said that he had a record, that he was a convicted sex offender. Others just kept their distance. But behind closed doors, more than a few parents had warned their children to stay away from that trailer. In a place where everyone knows everyone, it was hard to ignore when something, or someone, didn't feel quite right. And when a young boy vanished on the 8th of March 2007, those uneasy feelings quickly turned to fear. The search began almost immediately, neighbours pouring into the streets, calling his name, checking sheds and backyards. But beneath the frantic urgency, an even darker thought crept in. Maybe the danger hadn't come from outside the neighbourhood. Maybe the monster had been living among them all along. Christopher Michael Barrios Jr. lived in one of those modest mobile homes in Canal Mobile Home Park in Brunswick, Georgia. Born on the 2nd of January 2001 to Mike Barrios and Latrina Keith, Christopher was 6 years old in the spring of 2007. He was the kind of kid that left an impression. With a towel tied around his shoulders like a cape, Christopher believed that he was a superhero. He was often spotted darting between the mobile homes, leaping over puddles and saving invisible citizens from imaginary villains. His favourites were Ben 10 and Spider-Man, and he'd watch them religiously, often reenacting entire scenes in the dirt outside his home, clutching action figures in each hand. Christopher lived with his father Mike in a trailer, just steps away from his grandparents, Sue and Jose Rodriguez. Their proximity wasn't just convenience, it was a lifeline. Every day after school, Christopher would hop off the bus and make a beeline for his grandmother's trailer. That became his daily ritual, a safe place, a warm plate of food, and the sound of Ben 10 playing on the computer while the scent of dinner filled the air. Sue absolutely doted on her grandson. She recollected, "Every day he gets off the bus from school, he comes and stays with me." Christopher loved his grandmother's cooking. His father, Mike, was a hard worker. When his shift ended in the evening, Christopher would walk the short familiar path back to their trailer from his grandparents' place. Mike recalled, "I always tried to get him what he wanted. He was a good kid and he deserved it." The family was small, but they were tightly bound. His mother, Latrina, was in jail in Savannah at the time, but Christopher never lacked for affection. He was a quiet child, content to stay close to home. He was afraid of the dark and he was especially wary of dogs, particularly large, unfamiliar ones. But he had a soft spot for cats. Christopher's bedroom was a testament to everything that he loved. A twin bed covered in superhero sheets, his shelves lined with Spider-Man figurines, Ben 10 gear and tiny cars. It was his own universe, safe, predictable, full of adventures and heroes, the kind who always saved the day. Neighbours in the trailer park knew him well. He was the boy who raced down the gravel road with a cape flapping behind him. The boy who knocked politely on his grandma's door every day after school. The boy who always waved when he saw you. March 8th, 2007 began like any other day in the Canal Mobile Home Park. One of those early spring evenings in Georgia where the light lingers a little. It was a Thursday, quiet and ordinary, filled with the usual routine. Kids played on the dirt streets, chasing each other between trailers. Mothers stood on porches with their arms folded. That afternoon, 6-year-old Christopher Barrios Jr. did exactly what he always did. He got off the school bus and walked the well-worn path to his grandparents' trailer. Inside, his grandmother Sue was waiting, just like every other weekday. Christopher kicked off his shoes, settled in front of the computer, and clicked into his favourite Ben 10 game. After a while, Sue called him to the table. He ate quietly, thanked his grandmother, and then, just as he'd done countless times before, he went back outside to play. It was just another early evening on Horseshoe Lane. At approximately 7:15 p.m, Christopher's father, Mike, was still at work when his phone began to ring. On the other end of the line was his girlfriend, Pamela. She was panicked as she told him that Christopher hadn't come home. She'd searched the trailer, the yard, checked with the neighbours and Sue, but Christopher was nowhere to be found. Mike's heart sank. He dropped everything and raced home. By the time he arrived, his family was already in motion. Sue had confirmed that Christopher had left her trailer not too long after dinner. It was supposed to be just a short walk home, less than a minute. He'd done it countless times before, but this time he never arrived. As darkness began to creep over the sky, a quiet dread settled over the community. Neighbours joined in the search, flashlights in hand. They fanned out across the 1.5-mile radius of the mobile home park, calling out his name. Some of the children had seen him earlier that evening. A few said he'd been sitting at the swing set around 5:30 p.m, just a stone's throw from his front door. But nobody could say where he went after that. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. There was a canal that bordered the trailer park. It was dark, winding and overgrown. It wasn't a place that Christopher ever played near. In fact, he was afraid of it. Still in desperation, the family went there. They pushed through the brush, their flashlight sweeping across the water's edge, but there was no sign of Christopher. Back at the trailer, the mood was quickly shifting, from worry to full-blown fear. Christopher never wandered far. He was quiet, shy. The kind of boy who liked his routines, who was cautious by nature. At last, Mike picked up the phone and dialed 911 to report his son missing. As the sun rose over Brunswick, Georgia, on the morning of March 9th, the mood in the Canal Mobile Home Park had shifted completely. What had started as a community's quiet evening was now the scene of urgency and desperation. Police officers, volunteers and family members had searched through the night, but there was no sign of 6-year-old Christopher Barrios Jr. By now, everyone feared the worst. The search kicked off at full throttle. It was a coordinated multi-agency effort. Officers combed through the neighbourhood on foot while others drove all-terrain vehicles through the thick brush and woods that bordered the park. A helicopter circled overhead, its heat sensors scanning the earth below for any sign of movement. The effort expanded rapidly. What began as a neighbourhood search grew into a massive regional operation within just 24 hours. The FBI joined in, and so did the Georgia Department of National Resources. Canals that hugged the edges of the mobile home park were probed and searched meticulously, but they found nothing. Sniffer dogs were eventually brought in. They caught a scent that led them from the swing set where neighbours had last seen Christopher to a wooden dock by the canal. Then the scent vanished. By nightfall, frustration and fear had set in. The next morning, police made it official. They were no longer treating this as a simple missing child case. They said that Christopher Barrios Jr. had most likely been abducted. There were no witnesses, nobody had seen a car, no screams, no signs of a struggle. It was as if Christopher had simply vanished in broad daylight, a terrifying thought for every parent in the area. Brunswick Police Chief Matt Doring addressed the growing concern and said, "A 6-year-old boy doesn't just disappear for this long on his own." The family too struggled to grasp the nightmare. Christopher's uncle, Frank, who also lived in the mobile home park, was in disbelief. He said to reporters, "I can't understand how this happened. There's not too much that goes on around here. I mean, this is a pretty safe place. Everybody pretty much minds their own business. But the facts told a different story. Police began interviewing residents door to door, and soon their attention turned to two men who were already known to authorities. There were two registered sex offenders that lived right there, on Horseshoe Lane. Detectives stressed that it was a routine part of a missing child investigation to interview nearby sex offenders, but it was still an unsettling revelation for the residents. As the search and interviews pressed on, posters with Christopher's photograph began appearing all across town. Hundreds were printed and volunteers came out in force to staple them to lampposts, pin them to bulletin boards and tape them to storefront windows.
It's Carolyn Knapp's first day out to search with her son John.
I have 8 grandbabies, and if something like this happened to me, I'd want people to help me.
As the daylight hours wind down, plans are already in the works for morning. Bright and early, back in gear.
One of those volunteers was Eric Friedrich, a local man who had never met Christopher but felt compelled to act. He stated, "I was working on my house this morning. I heard about this on the radio and I thought I'd come over and join the group." But behind the swell of support was a darker truth. Fear was tightening its grip. The idea that a child predator could be lurking among them was no longer abstract. It was personal. Parents began keeping their children indoors. Amy Embury, a local mother, spoke for many when she said, "My kids are not going out in the yard by themselves. I've been talking to them more about strangers and not going out by themselves." But amid the fear, the community stood united during a candlelight vigil. They gathered together one evening, each holding a flickering candle against the cold. They prayed, they cried, and they hoped. Sam Leons, whose son was close friends with Christopher, spoke through tears and said, "We're all family. He's a child of this community." By the 4th day of the search, hope was beginning to unravel. On the 11th of March, detectives made an announcement. A $26,000 reward was now being offered for the safe return of 6-year-old Christopher. The search expanded from woods to canals to far darker places. Dumpsters, drainage ditches, mobile parking lots, and deserted dirt roads off the fringes of Glynn County. It was clear that detectives were no longer just searching for Christopher. They were maybe searching for his body. And as grim as that was, they were also looking at the people who lived closest to him. And that meant returning to the unsettling presence just across the street. Just a stone's throw away from Christopher's front door lived a man that made the entire trailer park uneasy. His name was George David Edenfield, and he was 32 years old. George lived with his parents, Peggy and David, in a mobile home that sat directly across from where Christopher lived with his father and his father's girlfriend. And George was a registered sex offender. In June of 1997, George had been convicted of 2 counts of child molestation after rubbing his clothed body against 2 young boys. He served time, he was released, he registered, but nothing about him really felt safe. Everyone in the Canal Mobile Home Park knew who he was. They warned their children to avoid him. They spoke about him in hushed tones. George was strange, they said, and not in a way that inspired sympathy. He stared at children, boldly, openly, as if he didn't care who saw him. Christopher's grandparents were no exception. They knew George and they kept a watchful eye. And yet one day after school, Christopher came into his grandparents' home with an unexpected comment. "George is nice, Grandma." It was enough to chill Sue to the very bone. She told her grandson firmly, "Stay away from George. Stay away from that house." She didn't mince her words. "They're bad people," she told him. And she wasn't wrong, because it wasn't just George who posed a danger. His father, David Edenfield, had his own disturbing past. Back in 1994, he pleaded guilty to incest after molesting his own daughter. Despite all of this, they remained right there, in the heart of the community. And at the time of Christopher's disappearance, George was technically on probation. Just 3 days before Christopher vanished, George had been sentenced to 10 years of probation for violating George's sex offender registry restrictions. He had been caught living within 1,000 feet of a playground in downtown Brunswick, a clear violation of a state law that passed just the year previous. That law was designed to keep predators away from vulnerable areas. Schools, churches, daycares, school bus stops, the very place where children lived and played. The judge had chosen probation, but George could have been sent to prison. If that had have happened, if George Edenfield had been behind bars, then maybe, just maybe, Christopher Barrios Jr. would still be alive. By this point in the investigation, one name had risen above all the others, George Edenfield. The attention of detectives had zeroed in on the man across the street, and it wasn't without cause. During a sweep of the trailer park, search teams discovered something small, almost insignificant on its own. In the Edenfields' front yard, they came across a Star Wars lightsaber toy. It belonged to Christopher. At first glance, it didn't raise any alarm. Christopher often played across the street. His grandmother, Sue, lived nearby. But taken into context, it was the first sign of something sinister. And then there was something else, something deeply unsettling. While neighbours were out in droves, canvassing every inch of land, calling out Christopher's name, handing out flyers, the Edenfields remained inside. George, David and Peggy. All three of them stayed behind closed doors. But they were watching. Detectives noticed them peering out through the curtains over and over again. And it wasn't long before witnesses started to speak up. Terry Frank, a neighbour, came forward with something disturbing. She told detectives that on the very afternoon that Christopher disappeared, she had seen the little boy outside the Edenfield trailer. She didn't know that George was a sex offender, but she knew instinctively that something about him was off. She commented, "He kept hitting on my kids and others. George would stand and watch the kids, and so would David." Detectives didn't waste any time. They brought George Edenfield in for questioning. George sat down in the interview room, and within minutes he began to talk. He told them something they had feared from the very beginning. Christopher was dead. He said he had watched from the window as the school bus dropped Christopher off that afternoon. He claimed that the devil had told him to kill the little boy. George said he lured Christopher over to the trailer under the pretense of playing video games. And once inside, he confessed to molesting and killing him. But the story didn't stay consistent. One moment, George insisted that Christopher was dead. The next, he changed his tune and said he was still alive. He refused to say where the body was. He mumbled that he was scared of going to prison. The detectives didn't need him to say much more. They already knew the case was no longer a search. It was a murder investigation. And the deeper they dug into the Edenfield household, the darker the story became. Just one day after a $26,000 reward was announced, detectives made their first arrest. It wasn't for murder, not yet. George Edenfield was taken into custody and charged with violating his probation, specifically for living too close to children. They didn't yet have the evidence to prove he had killed Christopher, but his disturbing confession and the mounting suspicions gave detectives enough cause to act. In cases like this, it's not uncommon for police to arrest a suspect on any charge they can, just to keep them in custody while they continue building the bigger case. While George was behind bars, things were unfolding fast. That same day, 2 employees from Atlanta Natural Gas arrived at the Edenfield trailer to check for methane gas. It was a routine check, but what they found was anything but routine. Their detectors picked up high levels of methane, a gas often produced by decomposing organic matter, bodies included. Detectives now believe what they had feared from the beginning, that Christopher was dead and that his body had been hidden. Later that same day, Peggy Edenfield was arrested. And it was in the interrogation room under hours of pressure that Peggy broke. She began to talk. At first, she said she had walked into George's bedroom and found Christopher playing video games. She told investigators she had warned her son to send him home, that he was a registered sex offender after all, but then she relented. Peggy told them, George has the mind of a 5-year-old. She said she allowed Christopher to stay as long as the door stayed open. But the next time she looked into the room, she said she found George molesting the little boy. And then she said she watched as her son strangled Christopher to death. She described how George washed Christopher's neck with soap and water, trying to erase his fingerprints. But just like George, Peggy's story began to change. She now claimed that it wasn't just George. She said that David, her husband and George's father, had helped to kill Christopher. Then another name surfaced, Donald Dale. Donald was a family friend, and much like George, he was mentally impaired with the cognitive capacity of a child. He had once lived at Hope House, a residential facility for people with mental disorders. That was where he had first met the Edenfields. According to Peggy, Donald had come over to help hook up cable converter boxes. But when he arrived, David had recruited him into the cover-up. She said that they stuffed Christopher's body into trash bags, loaded him into a vehicle, and drove out near Brunswick Airport to dump his remains. By now, detectives weren't just dealing with one suspect. George Edenfield was already in custody. But now his parents, Peggy and David, were arrested on charges of concealing a death, obstruction of an officer, and giving a false statement. Donald Dale was also arrested on the same charges. 4 adults, all entangled in something that sounded like a horror movie. And yet one question remained unanswered. Where was Christopher? Brunswick Airport was only a mile from the trailer park where Christopher had lived. It sat at the edge of coastal Georgia, surrounded by a sprawl of woodland and marsh, thick with trees, and nearly impossible to search in full. The dense undergrowth and isolation made it the kind of place where people went to dump things they didn't want found. On the morning of the 15th of March, 4 days after George, Peggy, and David Edenfield had been arrested, the search led police into those woods. There was a heavy law enforcement presence spread across the area, combing the underbrush. And then something caught their attention. Corporal Jesse Cook and Sergeant John Harwell noticed tire tracks veering off the road and cutting a shallow curve towards the tree line. They stopped their car, stepped out, and just beyond the foliage, around 15 feet off the road, they saw something. It was a black trash bag half concealed in the brush. As they approached, an overwhelming stench met them. It was the unmistakable smell of decomposition. Inside the bag was the nude and badly decomposed body of Christopher Michael Barrios Jr. Mike, his father, was informed of the discovery. He said he wanted to see his son for one final time. Police Chief Matt Doring later reflected. That was the hardest part. When it's your only son that's been killed, and you want to go and look for the last time. That's tough. The Edenfields had given so many different versions of events, it was hard to know what to believe. But the truth, when it finally emerged, was far worse than anybody could have ever imagined. The breakthrough came the day after Christopher's body was found. David Edenfield had cracked. He told investigators that he had walked into George's bedroom and found his wife and son there with Christopher. He said George removed Christopher's clothing and then molested him. He said that he was innocent, telling the detectives, "No, sir, I'm not a killer. It's a horrible, horrible thing to do. I don't know why George did it." That was all he was willing to say, at first. But when detectives placed photographs of Christopher's decomposed body in front of him, David started to talk. He said that it wasn't just George. It wasn't just him. It was the entire family. David admitted that he and George had taken turns molesting Christopher while Peggy, his wife, watched and masturbated. The horrific abuse lasted for 2 hours. And all throughout it all, Christopher begged. David said he told them that he was going to tell his parents. But they didn't stop. David said that George then announced that they would need to kill Christopher. He wrapped his hands around the little boy's throat and began to choke him. Christopher didn't scream, he just cried. He said no and stop over and over again. George didn't stop, and neither did David. David told detectives that he placed his own hands on top of his son's and helped him finish the job. Detective Raymond Sarro asked him, "You saw your opportunity when George was choking him to see what it felt like?" David replied, "Yes, sir." And then he said something that left detectives stunned. Christopher was dead. I guess it excited all of us. After the murder, David said that Peggy and Donald Dale put Christopher's body in a black trash bag and stashed it in a back room of the trailer. He claimed that Dale had been there the entire time. He was supposedly there to fix a TV. Later, the group put the bag in the trunk of a car and drove it out to a field to dispose of. But they didn't like that spot, so they turned back. David said that he went back inside, while the rest went back out and left Christopher's body where it was eventually found. At one point, detectives left David alone in the interrogation room with the photographs of Christopher in front of him. David picked them up, muttered to himself, and then tossed them aside. When Detective Sarro returned and asked what he thought, David responded, "It's my fault. I should have been a grown man and stopped it, but I didn't. I should be punished. I guess, go to prison and get killed for it." When asked whether he felt anything when he looked at the images, he said, "It's a horrible, horrible sight. It never should have happened." An autopsy would confirm the horrors that David had described. Christopher had been asphyxiated, and he had extensive injuries to his throat, genitals, and legs. There was even a human bite mark on his back. The level of decomposition made it difficult to recover DNA, but investigators found saliva on Christopher's back and semen traces on the plastic bags he had been stuffed into. As details of the case came out, Prosecutor Kelly said, "This is one of the most horrific crimes that I have seen in 21 years. On the 21st of March, the community of Brunswick came together once more. This time it wasn't to search or hope, it was to say goodbye. Christopher's funeral was held at Edo Miller and Sons Funeral Home. People arrived in silence. Some carried flowers, others brought toys and Spider-Man figurines. Spider-Man had been Christopher's favourite. Near the front entrance to the Macintosh room, a wicker basket filled with basketballs sat alongside a bowl of colourful markers. Children lined up one by one and quietly signed their names. They left drawings and little messages of love. Inside, the walls were lined with wreaths, delicate flowers arranged in circles. At the centre of it all was Christopher's small wooden casket, adorned with a Spider-Man wreath. Beside it stood his father, Mike. He stood tall, unmoving, his eyes fixed on his son. A tiny bicycle sat to the side. He looked at the mourners and said quietly, "That's my little boy's bike. He loved Spider-Man." Mike's mother, Sue, stood silently beside him. His grandfather, Louis, sat nearby. A walking stick was across his lap and his eyes were on the floor as people offered their condolences. He didn't look up, he just cried. Around 800 people came to Christopher's funeral that day. Teachers, friends, strangers who had never met him, but felt as though they knew him. A fire department honour guard stood vigil over the casket, a tribute to a little boy whose short life had touched so many. Before the service began, Christopher's mother, Latrina, stepped forward. She placed her hand gently on the casket, bowed her head, and prayed. The service was led by Reverend Chris Foster, who addressed the room and said, "If we make decisions out of anger and hurt, we're not honouring Christopher. He was a peaceful child, a wonderful, beautiful young man." But even as the community mourned, justice was already moving forward. Just hours before the funeral, a grand jury returned indictments against George, David, and Peggy Edenfield. Each was charged with murder, child molestation, enticing a child for indecent purposes, and false imprisonment. Prosecutors announced that they would seek the death penalty against all three. Only Donald Dale was spared the capital charge. He wasn't accused of harming Christopher directly, but he had allegedly helped dispose of his body after the murder. He now faced charges of concealing a death and tampering with evidence, crimes that carried a potential sentence of 1 to 10 years in prison. The Edenfields would all be tried separately, a process that promised to be as grueling and painful as the investigation itself. In the weeks that followed the arrest, the Edenfields did everything they could to keep the grisly truth of what happened to Christopher from the public. Peggy's defence attorney, Richard Allen, filed a motion asking that all pre-trial hearings, records and other court documents be closed to both the media and the public. He also requested that anybody involved in the case be barred from speaking about it. But for those who had already lived through the unimaginable, it felt like a cruel request. Christopher's grandmother, Sue, said, "I think Peggy will still get a fair trial. Christopher didn't get treated fairly, but I think she will." The case has moved painfully slow through the justice system, delayed by legal wrangling and mental evaluations. Then in December, Donald Dale asked the judge to consider a plea agreement. He claimed he had a diminished mental capacity and offered to plead guilty to a single felony count of giving false statements. In exchange, he would serve a 5-year sentence, suspended if he entered a facility for people with developmental disabilities. He also agreed to be banned from Glynn County. His attorney, John Welzer, argued that Dale had been manipulated by the Edenfields. He said, "He lied and made all those inconsistent statements to the police because he was scared. He's mentally retarded, and because he was scared, he told them what they wanted to hear." Phone records backed part of Dale's claim that he wasn't involved. He had received a call from the Edenfields around 8:30 p.m. the night that Christopher vanished. They told him that they had a new video game system. Dale arrived at their trailer shortly after 9 p.m, just before police showed up to begin their search. While the judge weighed Dale's plea, there was a major shift in Peggy's case. It was announced that she would no longer face the death penalty. Instead, Peggy had agreed to testify against both her husband and her son in exchange for a possible sentence of life in prison with parole. Just days later, Dale's plea agreement was accepted. Judge Stephen Scarlett ordered a mental health evaluation and sentenced Dale to 3 more months in jail, followed by 3.5 years of probation in a state home for the mentally disabled. Meanwhile, the Edenfields cases continued their slow crawl towards trial. As the 1-year anniversary of Christopher's death approached, his mother filed a wrongful death lawsuit. The lawsuit named Sharon O'Quinn, the owner of the trailer park where Christopher had lived with his father. According to Latrina, O'Quinn knowingly rented homes to convicted child molesters, making the community dangerous for children like Christopher. She also filed a lawsuit against a caseworker from the Georgia Department of Children and Family Services. She alleged that the worker had acted in a grossly negligent manner when approving Christopher's placement with his father, Mike. And then, in an unimaginable twist, the Barrios family was forced to endure another blow. In October of 2008, a photograph of Christopher was used as a background prop in an episode of General Hospital Night Shift. The image, which had been used without permission, appeared briefly on a computer screen during a scene, sparking outrage. ABC, the network behind the show, issued a formal apology and launched an investigation into how the photo had ended up on the set. But it wasn't enough. The Barrios family ultimately sued ABC for up to $75,000 for the unauthorized use of their son's image. David was the first of the Edenfields to stand trial. By the 30th of September 2009, a jury had been selected and seated. They had been brought in from Jeff Davis County. Opening statements were then ready to begin. Prosecutor John Johnson stood before the jury and revealed the horrific details of Christopher's murder. He referred to what had happened as the most horrible 2 hours of his life. He said that he had pleaded with the Edenfields as they stripped him naked and sexually assaulted him and then killed him. He said to the jury, Christopher Barrios didn't want to be there. He told them to let him go. He said, I want to leave. Let me go. Don't do this. I'm going to tell my parents. He was stripped of his clothes and sexually molested by George Edenfield. Then David Edenfield became part of it and began molesting Christopher too. The prosecutor then described the murder, telling the jury, George Edenfield initially put his hands around Christopher's neck and began to choke him. And at that point in time, David Edenfield, who was participating in all of this, put his hands instinctively, as you will hear him say, on top of George Edenfield's hands and helped him take the life of Christopher Barrios. David's defence attorney James Yancey told the jury that David's son George was a convicted child molester who had confessed to killing Christopher. He claimed that David's confession was influenced by the police officers who questioned him. However, he stopped short of claiming the confession was coerced. The prosecution then began their case by calling Christopher's family to testify. They spoke about the day of the disappearance and searching for him before calling police. The prosecution then presented David's videotaped confession. After it was played, Detective Raymond Sarro testified about David's confession. Christopher was dead and disposed of by the time police arrived at the trailer park to search for him, he said. He also spoke about George's confession, telling the jury, I asked if the devil told him to do anything to hurt the little boy. He told me yes, that the devil told him to kill. Testimony was then presented about Donald Dale. While David had claimed that he was present for the murder, his landlord, Tim Frayne, said otherwise. He said that he was with Dale from 9 a.m. that morning until about 8:45 p.m. By this point, Christopher was already dead and disposed of. The pathologist who performed Christopher's autopsy, Dr. Jamie Downs, testified next. He said that his supply of oxygen had been choked off when his windpipe, voice box, and carotid artery had been crushed. He testified, the most likely means this was done by was a forearm sleeper chokehold around the neck, or by placing the palms of the hands on opposite sides of the neck and compressing inward. He spoke about the injuries that were consistent with sexual abuse, telling the jury they had been sustained while Christopher was still alive. The prosecution then produced their final witness, Peggy Edenfield. Peggy said that on the day Christopher was killed, she had found him in her son's bedroom playing video games. She claimed she had grabbed Christopher by the hand, led him to the door, and then walked him home. However, Peggy then recanted that statement. Peggy then said she didn't try to get Christopher out of the home, even though she knew her son was a sex offender who wasn't allowed to be near children. Peggy then tried to distance herself from the sexual assault and murder. She said that when she left the bathroom, she found her husband and son sodomizing Christopher. Peggy repeatedly sighed and hesitated as she testified. She told the jury, my son had his hands around the boy's neck and my husband had his hands on top of George's. I tried to get my husband's hands off my son's and my son's off the boy's neck, but I couldn't. She admitted that there was a phone nearby, but she didn't call 911 or think to run outside for help. She explained, I didn't do nothing. I didn't know my neighbours that good. Peggy said that David carried Christopher's body from their trailer to the trunk of the car. The videotaped interrogation of Peggy was then played for the jury. It corroborated much of what David had said during his interrogation. She described both her husband and George sexually assaulting Christopher and then strangling him together. She even admitted to masturbating while they sexually assaulted and killed him. After that, both the prosecution and defence rested. The defence didn't call a single witness. The closing arguments were then presented. Prosecutor Stephen Kelly reminded the jury of David's confession. He also highlighted Peggy's confession and testimony as well as the autopsy evidence. He said that all of these things substantiated the confession, telling the jury, I tell you the evidence in this case, as confusing as it may be, all boils down to this. David Edenfield has convicted himself with his own words. Defence attorney James Yancey said during his closing arguments that David was a common everyday man who had been beaten down by his vindictive wife and a burden of a son. He stated, "There's no DNA evidence of anybody other than Christopher." The jury were then sent off to deliberate. It took them just 2 hours to reach a verdict. They found David Edenfield guilty. Less than an hour later, the same jury were back for the sentencing phase. The prosecution called psychologist Philip Barron, who testified that David was mentally able to tell the difference between right and wrong. Then there were victim impact statements. Mike became emotional as he recalled how Christopher's smile would cheer him up on his bad days. Through tears he said, "I often look at his pictures and it hurts so bad that I won't see this child grow up to be a man." Christopher's grandmother Sue stated, "My only joy is my kids, and a chunk of it's gone. I had to quit my job. It's hard to do anything with all of this." The jury deliberated for just 2 hours again, before deciding that David Edenfield deserved to die. The judge then sentenced him to death. He additionally sentenced him to life on 2 counts of aggravated child molestation and 20 years each on charges of child molestation and cruelty to children. Outside of court, Mike said that he wanted to be present for the execution. He stated, "If I'm not dead by then, I'll be there, and so will my mum." After David was sent to death row, the lawyers for his son, George, argued that he was not mentally competent to defend himself in court. In August, Judge Scarlett ruled that George was mentally incompetent and ordered him committed to a state mental hospital. His defence attorney, Gerald Word, said, "He knows he's going to a hospital. We explained that to him, but I'm not sure he really understands what that means. I'm not sure this won't be a lifetime process for him." Christopher's grandmother, Sue, had some comments after the court hearing. She stated, "He ain't crazy. He's smart as a damn whip. He's got them all fooled. He's putting on a good show." Mike wasn't in court for the hearing. Sue said that he often went to his son's grave and just sat there alone and cried. In September of 2011, Peggy was sentenced to 60 years in prison after she pleaded guilty to 5 of the 8 charges against her. She had pleaded guilty but mentally disabled to false imprisonment, child molestation for masturbating while Christopher was sexually assaulted and killed, second-degree cruelty to children, concealing the death of another, and tampering with evidence. Afterwards, Mike commented that he didn't want a plea deal. He said he was happy that Peggy would never get out of prison, but that the plea offered no closure. He stated, "Christopher wouldn't have wanted me bargaining like that. It's good to see she'll die in prison, but she deserves worse. Nothing will bring Christopher back." Today, all of the Edenfields remain locked up. David and Peggy are in prison while George is committed to a state mental health facility. In 2011, he was examined by Karen Bailey Smith, head of forensic services for the State Department of Behavioural Health and Developmental Disabilities. She found that he didn't understand the death penalty. When she asked him what he thought it meant, he responded, "I can get an injection and go to sleep." She asked for how long. He replied, "Like, for the rest of my life." He believed the judge's role in a trial was simply to say, "All rise and be seated." He didn't understand a plea telling the doctor, "If I plead guilty, I go to jail or to the hospital. If I plead not guilty, I go home." It's unlikely that George Edenfield will ever stand trial. Well, besties, that is it for this episode of Morbidology. As always, thank you so much for listening, and I'd like to say a massive thank you to my newest supporters up on Patreon: DC, Bree, Ash, Vea, and Wendy. Your support up on Patreon seriously goes such a long way, and I genuinely am eternally grateful. If you'd like to join, I upload ad-free in early release episodes, behind the scenes, and I also send out a thank you card along with some cool merch. There's also a bunch of bonus Morbidology Plus episodes that aren't on the regular podcast platforms. If you'd like to support the show in another way, please consider leaving a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you may be listening. Remember to check us out at morbidology.com for more information about this episode and to read some true crime articles. Until next time, take care of yourselves, stay safe, and have an amazing week.